The world called him prince, and he learned to walk among marble columns and echoes of applause. Yet within him lay a silence that no court could fill. He grew up with gold on his fingers and rules on his shoulders, educated as one who must rule, not as one who must save. Yet on sleepless nights, his soul had heard a different whisper, a call that clashed with the brightness of the candlesticks. It is curious how God works in contradiction to the spotlight. When the crowd raised the title, heaven was already planning another script. The human stage gave him a name. The divine purpose would require him to shed that name and learn to carry another weight, lighter for the eyes of the world and heavier for his heart, the weight of service. At the very point where vanity could have been his permanent prison, something pushed him out of the palace, not as punishment, but as preparation. God didn't just want to position Moses, he wanted to polish his soul, stripping away the layers that sutured him to comfort, to reveal what the throne could never form: fidelity under humiliation, courage under oblivion, and love for a people no one else could see. Thus, the story that seemed to be heading toward human glory veered into a desert where time would teach the language of silence, where identity would be redesigned far from mirrors and titles. Perhaps today you are surrounded by everything others define as success: contracts, applause, a name that opens doors, and yet you feel a void that no achievement fills. This dissonance is no coincidence. It is often a divine warning. When the world lifts, the heart may be being called to fall and something new is born. There is a subtle yet decisive difference between promotion and purpose, and God sometimes uses apparent loss to realign our story with his eternal design. Moses was not scorned by fate when removed from the palace. He was invited to learn to listen without noise, to obey without trophies, and to love without recognition. The crux of this narrative is not to humiliate earthly success, but to redefine it through the prism of heaven. What man exalts, God can use to test him. What man bestows, God can demand back so that something deeper may be born. If upon hearing this your heart moved, if a part of you recognized this silent call, respond with the gesture of your soul, not just with words. Declare in your heart that you prefer to be shaped by the desert than trapped by splendor. And if you like, write in the comments, "I choose God's ear above the world's applause." The palace called him son, but his blood screamed slave. Moses walked between two realities that never touched: the gold he wore and the pain he saw. He grew up surrounded by servants, yet unable to feel like one of them, and equally unable to feel equal to those who served him. It was as if his soul inhabited a rift between two worlds, and in both he was displaced. With every glance he cast through the windows of Egypt, he saw the contrast between the glory of the walls and the dust of the bent bodies outside. The sound of chains echoed louder within him than the chants of the court. And there began the true conflict: what to do when comfort becomes a prison disguised as a blessing. At that time, no one could have imagined what heaven was plotting in silence. Egypt saw a promising prince, but heaven saw a servant in the making. God was about to interrupt the perfect script of a man who had everything, to make him lose it all and discover what was truly worthwhile. There are times when the divine invades everyday life without warning, and what was once secure begins to crumble. It was so with Moses. A thoughtless gesture, an impulse of human justice, pulled him from the zone where applause protected him and cast him to the ground of anonymity. He had touched the line between power and conscience. And destiny, guided by the invisible hands of God, began to be fulfilled in the most paradoxical way possible, through the fall of the one everyone believed to be on the rise. And perhaps, without realizing it, you're on that same threshold. The success that once sustained you now rings hollow. The words that exalted you now weigh you down. What seemed like victory no longer has any flavor. This is how the divine movement begins. When the soul realizes that applause has lost its meaning, heaven prepares a new calling. Moses didn't know it yet, but God was about to use him as a liberator, and before liberating a nation, he would need to liberate man from himself. This is the point where history changes, where the prince disappears and the servant is born. Because sometimes God needs to destroy what the world has built in you to reveal what he himself has planted in silence. If this truth touches what is most hidden within you, write in the comments, "I am ready for the desert that reveals." Moses was born in a time when life was already an act of resistance. Even before he opened his eyes, a death decree had already been placed upon his generation. Egypt feared the growth of the Hebrew people, and out of fear decided to control the birth of innocence. The Pharaoh, fearing loss of the throne, ordered every Hebrew boy to be thrown into the Nile. That river, which sustained the empire's economy, would become the burial ground for the children of promise. And it was in this desperate situation that God began to write a story that the throne would never understand. As the hands of power tried to silence the future, a mother, hidden in the darkness of her home, decided to believe that God still saw. Jochebed, the woman whose name is rarely remembered, did the unthinkable. She took her newborn son, covered him with tears, and placed him inside a basket, sealed with faith. She cast Moses into the same river that swallowed the dreams of so many mothers, but she did so with a prayer, "Lord, if I cannot protect, your purpose can." The faith of an anonymous woman defied the decree of an empire, and that small basket became the symbol of divine paradox. While Egypt killed, God planted liberators in the stream. The Nile that swallowed destinies became the path of providence. Pharaoh's daughter found him, and the baby condemned to death was welcomed into the heart of the house that persecuted him. The God who rules over the waters caused the future liberator of Israel to be raised among the very people who had threatened him. Moses grew up amid luxury, learning, and power, but within him, something always betrayed him. He didn't belong there. As much as he spoke the language of Egypt, there was an echo in his soul that sounded in another tongue, the language of promise. And so, the prince's story began to be shaped by the tension between two worlds, the one that created him and the one that called him. Egypt taught him to think like a king, but heaven prepared him to serve as a prophet. He learned to wear the crown, but something inside him yearned to carry the staff. Because when God has a purpose, even the enemy's cradle can become a training ground. These days, perhaps Egypt has a different name: status, position, stability, image. But the dilemma remains the same. What to do when what protects you also imprisons you? How many times does God need to take us from seemingly safe places to remind us that security and purpose don't always go hand in hand? Moses grew up surrounded by everything the world valued, but God wouldn't let him die in the comfort of a palace. Because God never calls anyone to remain where the ego is fed. He calls them to the places where the soul is forged. And perhaps this is the invitation that the Spirit is making to you now, to leave the inner Egypt, the zones where everything seems stable, but the presence no longer dwells. If this introduction spoke to what God is generating within you, write in the comments, "Lord, teach me to leave the palace." Moses learned early on that existing between two worlds means carrying the weight of a divided identity. In Egypt, he was the prince everyone respected, the young man with access to the secrets of science, war, and royalty. But within him, there was a void no master could fill. Hebrew blood ran silently through his veins, like a secret that burned with every glance he cast upon his slaves. He grew up hearing himself called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, but when he saw the suffering of the Hebrews, something inside him whispered, "These are your brothers." It was as if his soul betrayed him, revealing a truth the throne tried to hide. On the outside, he wore the linen robes and jewels of the empire. On the inside, he bore the burden of an origin no one else recognized. He lived in a conflict that only purpose could explain, being too Hebrew to be Egyptian and too Egyptian to be Hebrew. This tension consumed him silently, shaping a man torn between what he inherited and what he was called to be. How many people today experience the same struggle? Men and women who walk the corridors of success but feel a calling that distances them from everything they've built. People who speak the language of the world but whose hearts beat to a different rhythm, that of eternity. Moses' hidden identity wasn't a mistake. It was the battlefield where God was preparing him. Because before freeing the people, Moses needed to be freed from the role Egypt had written for him. God doesn't work with what we appear to be. He works with what the world hasn't yet discovered we are. And sometimes, to reveal our true who we are, he needs to allow everything we pretend to be to crumble. Moses didn't know it, but the discomfort he felt in the palace was the harbinger of a new spiritual birth. He wasn't rejected by God. He was chosen to be deconstructed. God's process is always silent at first. It begins as uneasiness, grows into discomfort, and ends in rebirth. Egypt applauded him, but heaven watched in silence, waiting for the day when the prince would tire of being called something he never was. When that day came, Moses discovered that true identity is not what men say we are, but what remains when God takes away everything they said. And perhaps today, God is inviting you to this same revelation. Perhaps what you call an identity crisis is simply a call to remember who you were before the world named you. When the Spirit of God begins to whisper, "This is no longer you," it's a sign that a new version is about to be born, not shaped by Egypt, but by the desert. If this resonates with you, write in the comments, "Lord, show me who I am when the world is silent." The conflict began before the escape, before the desert, before the call. It began within him, in the place where voices are not silenced, but rather overlap. Moses was the prince whom all Egypt admired, but no human glory could silence the pain of seeing his own people oppressed. Every blow a Hebrew received to the body, he felt in his soul. Every cry muffled by the whips hurt him more than any sword could. And while the empire clothed him in gold, his conscience stripped him naked before God. There was an invisible war between what he saw and what he lived. On one hand, the comfort of a secure life. On the other, the restlessness of a purpose that called him out of his comfort zone. This tension haunted him like a shadow, until one day, the inevitable happened. He saw an Egyptian wounding a Hebrew, and something inside him exploded. The prince gave way to the hidden servant, the diplomat gave way to the vigilante. In a thoughtless act, Moses killed the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. That sand covered the man the world knew, but it also revealed the man God was about to transform. Moses' sin wasn't just murder, it was trying to fulfill a spiritual purpose with his own hands. He wanted to free, but without yet being freed. He wanted to correct injustice, but without yet understanding that God's justice is not born of anger, but of redemption. It was in this era that his process began. Because God doesn't waste failures, he uses them as portals to repentance and reconstruction. How often do we too try to rush God's plan? How often, driven by passion and impatience, do we do what is right with the wrong heart? This is where the true inner conflict arises, the desire to obey, but still fighting the old self that insists on acting on its own. Moses didn't just flee Egypt that day, he fled from himself. The man who buried the Egyptian in the sand didn't know he was actually burying his old self. God allows these ruptures because they break the cycle of self-sufficiency. When the heart is divided between what the world offers and what the Spirit whispers, heaven collapses, not to destroy, but to purify. Moses needed to be stripped of everything that made him appear strong to learn that true strength lies not in control, but in surrender. And perhaps right now, you're struggling with something similar, a painful calling, a desire to change, but unsure how to let go of what feels safe. The conflict you feel isn't a lack of faith. It's a sign that the Spirit is at work. When God begins to shake the foundations, it's because the old structure no longer serves. If this word reaches you in the midst of this silent struggle, Write in the comments, Lord, conquer in me what still resists. It was in the silence of exile that God began to speak. Moses, the man who once commanded servants, now herded sheep that weren't even his. The prince who knew the secrets of the court now knew the secrets of the desert. The sound of the wind among the stones, the chill of dawn, and the silence that hurts more than any scream. Time had passed. Egypt had forgotten him, and the world had moved on. But God does not forget those he has chosen. He simply changes the setting to teach what the palace could never teach: dependence. It was there, amidst the dust and anonymity, that the sky interrupted the most ordinary routine. Moses was following the flock when he saw something that made him stop. A bush that burned but was not consumed. The fire was there, but the fire did not destroy. He approached, curious, and then he heard the voice that would change his history. Moses, Moses. That double call was not just a summons, it was a restoration of identity. The God who saw him born amid death was now calling him again, as if awakening the purpose that time had tried to erase. Do not come any closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. This phrase marked a turning point. Moses was not called to reign, but to strip himself naked. The God of the universe spoke to him not about power, but about holiness. Not about status, but about presence. While Egypt valued the crown, God asked for the removal of shoes. God's call always begins with an act of surrender. He begins not with human glory, but with surrender. The voice continued, I have seen the affliction of my people in Egypt, and I have come down to deliver them. Now, therefore, go, and I will send you to Pharaoh. God didn't just call him. He sent him back to the place he feared most. Because the true calling is not to escape pain, but to redeem it. Moses had fled Egypt in shame, but now God sent him back with purpose. The very ground where he fell would be the stage where God would display his glory. This is how God works. He transforms the place of our guilt into an altar of redemption. But Moses hesitated. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? He still saw himself as a fugitive, while God already saw him as a liberator. Human insecurity always tries to compromise the divine calling. He looked at his hands and saw only what he had lost. God looked at the same hands and saw what was yet to come. God's calling is not based on who we were, but on what he decided to do through us. Today, many still hear this voice echoing within their hearts, a voice that doesn't ask for a resume, but for courage, a voice that doesn't demand perfection, but for availability. The same fire that didn't consume the bush is the fire that still burns within those God calls. And perhaps what appears to be mere spiritual curiosity is the beginning of a divine calling. If this word reminds you that the fire still burns, even when everything seems to be out, write in the comments, Lord, speak again, I'm listening. Moses always believed that time had forgotten him, that the calling that once set him ablaze in Egypt had faded along with the embers of the desert fires. He believed it was already too late to be used, too late to begin again, too late to carry any promise. But the desert, this place that seemed like the end, was, in fact, the womb where God formed prophets. Because the desert is not the tomb of the forgotten, it is the furnace of the chosen. It was there, between the dry wind and the silence of the sands, that something broke the logic of time. An ordinary bush in an ordinary place began to burn without being consumed. And the ordinary became the altar of divine presence. Moses approached, and when the voice spoke from the midst of the fire, everything within him trembled. Because the voice he heard was not the voice of a new calling. It was the same voice as before, only matured by time. Moses, Moses, said God, and the name the world had forgotten was spoken again on the lips of the Eternal. The name that Egypt had erased, that the desert had silenced, God called back into existence. And this is the revelation that humanity needs to understand. When God speaks your name, he is not just calling, He is resurrecting what you have allowed to die within you. Moses prostrates himself. The sand that once burned now becomes holy ground, and God reveals to him what had been hidden all along. The purpose was not dead, it was being refined. The past Moses rejected, the Egypt he fled, the desert he endured, all were part of the same plan. Nothing was lost. Everything was preparation. And it is at this moment that the man who saw himself as a shepherd realizes that, in truth, he was being trained to lead nations. The staff that served to guide animals would become the symbol of God's authority over kings and empires. The desert that made him feel forgotten was the same one that taught him to depend on God's voice more than any human power. The revelation comes with tears and fear. God had never forgotten him. The time that seemed like silence was in fact the interval in which heaven adjusted earth's destiny. Moses understands that God's call never expires, only matures, that the divine voice is not lost with the years, it simply waits for the right heart to hear it. And perhaps this is also your revelation today. Time didn't erase you, the desert didn't kill you, and God's silence wasn't rejection, it was the harbinger of a revelation. There are things that can only be said when the heart is still, when pride dies, when haste gives way. The fire burning in the bush is nothing else. It's the same fire that once burned within you. It simply waited for the right moment to rekindle. So when God calls you by name, it's not just to use you, it's to remind you of who you've always been. And before that voice, all escape ceases, all guilt is silenced, and all doubt is dispelled. Because when God speaks, the desert becomes a mountain, and the forgotten man becomes a prophet. When the fire subsided and the voice ceased, Moses was no longer the same man. The desert was still the same, vast, arid, silent, but something inside him had changed forever. He now carried an invisible weight, the weight of presence. God had not merely called him, God had clothed him. The voice that called him from the bush was not commanding him to return as a fugitive, but as one sent. Moses, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. These words cut into his soul like blades. Return to Egypt? Return to the place of his shame, the scene of his error, the land that had rejected him? Everything in him screamed no. But the divine mission almost never makes human sense. God didn't call him back as one reliving the past, but as one redeeming promises. Moses tried to argue, who am I to go to Pharaoh? He still saw himself as small, limited, trapped in his old self. But God didn't respond by exalting Moses. He responded by revealing himself. I will be with you. This is the essence of every heavenly mission. It's not about who we are. It's about who goes with us. Egypt, with its thrones and golden gods, represented the world system, an empire of pride, vanity, and slavery. And the people, subjugated for centuries, had forgotten even the sound of freedom. It was for them that God called Moses, for those who groaned in the shadows, for those who still prayed, believing that God would remember. But before freeing others, Moses would need to be free within himself. He still carried the fear of Egypt, the weight of guilt, the insecurity of the past. God, however, would not let him go without first giving him a sign. What do you have in your hand? The Lord asked. And Moses answered, a staff. The simple symbol of a shepherd became the instrument of miracles. God transformed the ordinary into the supernatural, because when the mission is divine, even the ordinary becomes prophetic. The staff that guided sheep would now guide multitudes. The hand that once trembled before the pharaohs would now be raised before the sea. God wasn't just sending him to free slaves, but to confront spiritual powers that had enslaved generations. Moses' mission was more than political, it was heavenly. He would be the channel of a spiritual revolution, the messenger of the invisible God before the golden gods. And each of us, at some point, is called to live the same mission, not to face flesh and blood pharaohs, but to confront the voices that hold us captive: fear, guilt, disbelief, conformity. For every "I can't" that leaves our lips, God responds with the same answer: I will be with you. The mission doesn't begin when everything is ready. It begins when we obey, even trembling. Moses didn't return because he was strong. He returned because he understood that if God promised to be with him, then no human throne could oppose him. And this is the essence of faith: walking not because we see, but because we hear. Perhaps God is also calling you to return to the place you fled, not to relive wounds, but to redeem stories, not to prove you've changed, but to show that He remains the same. When God sends you, even the desert bows to your purpose. And so, with his staff in his hand and the presence of God in his heart, Moses descended from the mountain. The desert wind seemed lighter, and for the first time, he wasn't running from anything. He was moving toward what he was born to do. Egypt still shone in the distance like an ancient dream. Its golden towers, its fertile rivers, its temples built to the glory of men and gods who believed they dominated the world. For Moses, however, that brilliance no longer fascinated. Now it wounded. He saw in the lights of the empire the reflection of the chains that bound his people. Every statue, every throne, every song of victory sounded like irony in the face of the stifled cries of the Hebrew slaves. As he re-entered the gates of Egypt, time seemed to fold in on itself. The same ground that had once seen him depart now welcomed him back, but the returning man was no longer the prince. Egypt awaited the fugitive. God was sending the prophet. The palace was filled with music, perfumes, and power. Pharaoh regarded him with disdain, remembering the man who had once fled, stained with guilt. "Who is this? Who dares to enter here as a messenger?" he asked with a wry smile. And Moses, without looking at the golden columns or the armed guards, raised his eyes to the throne and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." The silence that followed was thick. No one dared breathe. It was as if eternity waited for the answer. And then Pharaoh laughed. He laughed as if listening to a joke. He laughed as if he considered himself invincible. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice?" It was the laughter of human pride, the sound that echoes whenever man believes himself greater than God. But Moses did not tremble, because when one carries a word born of fire, no earthly throne can intimidate. The same staff that guided the desert now rested in his hands like a heavenly decree. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh was not merely political, it was spiritual. Two kingdoms stared each other in the eye, that of man and that of God. And Egypt, which seemed so powerful, would soon discover that no crown shines before the glory of the eternal. The plagues came. Blood in the rivers, frogs in the houses, darkness over the land, the cry of the firstborn. Each blow was a wound to the empire's pride. Each sign was a reminder that true power lies not in force, but in obedience. But there's something deeper here. Moses also confronted his own past. Every time he entered Pharaoh's presence, he confronted the voice that once called him a murderer, the fear that drove him to flee, the trauma that made him doubt. Because the greatest confrontation isn't with the visible enemy, it's with the voices that try to convince us we are still who we once were. And perhaps this is the confrontation God calls you to experience, returning to the place where you fell, not to relive the pain, but to redeem history. God doesn't just want to free you from your chains. He wants to make you a liberator of others. Egypt, with all its splendor, began to crumble. The throne that seemed unshakable began to tremble. And amid each sign, Moses learned an eternal truth. God's power is not manifested in the absence of resistance, but in faithfulness in the midst of confrontation. The man who had once fled now stood firm against the very empire that had destroyed him. And Pharaoh, who had thought himself a god, was beginning to realize that the desert dust knew a God more real than all his deities. Confrontation is inevitable for anyone with a purpose. Because the call that comes from heaven always confronts the structures that were born of the earth, Egypt was wounded but not broken. Each plague seemed to shake its foundations, but Pharaoh's heart hardened even more, like stone that resists fire. With each plea from the Hebrews, with each sign from heaven, the empire's unbelief grew stronger. For there are hearts that prefer the throne to the truth, the crown to surrender. The world, when confronted with light, always tries to justify darkness. Moses saw this happen before his own eyes. He saw God's power being revealed, and at the same time, he saw people turning their faces away. It was a painful paradox. The more heaven spoke, the more people closed themselves off. And perhaps this is one of the greatest pains of those who are called, realizing that not everyone wants to listen, even when God speaks clearly. The opposition didn't just come from Pharaoh, it came from the people themselves. Many Hebrews, tired of waiting, murmured against Moses. "We used to be slaves, but at least we had something to eat," they said, as if freedom were too much to bear. The same people who cried out for liberation now doubted the liberator. The same staff that had paved the way for miracles was now the target of criticism and accusations. And so it is with us too. When the process takes time, when the miracle seems distant, the human heart turns against the instrument God uses. Unbelief cannot stand the test of time. And Moses felt firsthand what every faithful servant feels: the loneliness of those who obey even without being understood. Egypt mocked him, the magicians tried to imitate him, the people doubted him, but heaven sustained him, and that was enough. Because those who walk with God learn that human approval is wind, but divine presence is rock. God never promised that the call would be applauded. He only promised that it would be followed. And that's why Moses didn't give up. Because even when everything around him was against it, there was something inside him that said, "Stand firm. What God started, He will finish." Opposition is proof that the purpose is true. Hell doesn't react to what is irrelevant. When resistance increases, it's a sign that something is about to break. And perhaps you're at that point today, facing criticism, disbelief, closed doors, and even voices telling you that God won't fulfill what He promised. But remember, when the world rises, it's because heaven is already acting. Moses discovered that the true test of faith isn't facing Pharaoh, it's remaining obedient even when your own people reject you. Because the mission doesn't depend on human recognition, but on God's approval. And so, while Egypt resisted and Israel murmured, God remained at work. Heaven does not rush, but it also never fails. The world's opposition does not stop the Eternal's plan. It only reveals who truly trusts Him. The night was dark, and the sound of Egyptian horses echoed like thunder behind the people. In front, the sea. Behind, the army. Despair hung over the crowd like a veil of fear. The people screamed, wept, and murmured, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt, Moses, to die here with no way out?" The wind carried the scent of panic, and God's silence seemed heavier than the waters before them. It was at that moment that Moses looked to the heavens, not for explanations, but for direction. Because there are times when faith doesn't ask for answers, it simply insists on remaining. Then God spoke, and His voice pierced fear like a sword. "Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. March." That word sounded like madness. March where? Into the sea. It was as if God was saying, "Don't wait until you see the path before you start walking. Start walking and the path will open." Faith in the impossible is this: moving when everything around you screams stop. It's believing when the horizon is still silent. It's raising your staff before the waters and waiting for the impossible to obey. Moses stretched out his arm. The wind blew from the east, strong, continuous, merciless. The sea began to tremble, and what had been an abyss opened into walls of glory. Dry land appeared between the waters, and the people crossed. Every step was a testimony, every breath was a miracle. Faith there wasn't a feeling, it was a decision. It was the act of walking when there was no bridge, of obeying when there was no logic, because faith isn't denying reality, it's trusting that God has authority over it. And perhaps that's what God is asking of you today, to keep marching, even when the path isn't yet clear, to lift up the staff of trust, even when the waters seem immovable. Because the sea never opens for those who wait to see first, it opens for those who choose to believe. The people crossed, and Egypt followed them. But the waters that opened for God's children closed over their enemies. What was a path for some was judgment for others, because the same presence that liberates also confronts. When the sun rose, the sea was calm, the people were free, and Egypt was silent. What seemed like the end turned out to be the beginning. Moses' faith not only parted the sea, it also opened a new era for Israel. Faith in the impossible isn't a magical power, it's total surrender. It's when you understand that it's not about moving the sea, but about moving the heart. And when the heart surrenders, the impossible bends. Perhaps your sea still lies before you, an illness, a loss, a closed door, a fear that keeps you from moving forward. But today, God tells you the same thing He told Moses. Don't look back, keep moving. Because the impossible is not an obstacle, it is the setting for a miracle. The sea had closed, the people were free, and the song of victory echoed across the desert. Tambourines sounded, voices were raised, tears mingled with the sand. For a moment, it seemed the story was over, but the desert had not yet spoken, and the desert always speaks. Soon the heat grew more intense, the thirst more cruel, and God's silence longer. The people who had previously been singing now murmured. The same group that had applauded Moses now questioned his leadership. The faith that had flared before the miracle faded before the delay. Such is the human heart, quick to celebrate, slow to persevere. Moses then experienced his most profound test, not before Pharaoh, nor before the waters, but before God and himself. The man who had faced the empire now had to face the ingratitude of those freed. The leader who had parted the sea now had to open his own heart to not give up. There were nights when Moses lay on the ground and wept. He couldn't understand how the same people who had seen the impossible now doubted the invisible. "Lord," he said, "why have you brought me here? These people are hard. Their words hurt me. Their lack of faith wearies me." And God, with divine patience, answered in silence, "I have brought you so that you may learn to know me, not just to serve me." Moses' final test wasn't freeing the people. It was learning to endure those God called him to love. Because true obedience isn't revealed when it's easy to lead, but when it's hard to remain. It was at this point that Moses discovered the weight and glory of his calling. He realized that purpose isn't a stage, it's an altar. It's not about speaking for God, it's about being shaped by Him. Every frustration, every tear, every unanswered prayer was part of the transformation process. And perhaps this is also your final test. Not the fight against the enemy, but the resilience to continue even when results don't appear. Perhaps God is teaching you to love without return, to serve without applause, to believe without seeing. Because there are victories that are not won before the crowds, but before your own heart. The desert wasn't Moses' punishment, it was his consecration. There, he learned that spiritual success isn't about having everything under control, but about continuing to trust when everything gets out of hand. The final test doesn't destroy the faithful servant. It reveals the gold hidden in their faith. And when Moses went up the mountain and saw the glory of God pass before him, he understood. What seemed like loss was the path to the presence. Egypt made him a prince, but the desert made him a friend of God. Perhaps this is what the Spirit wants to tell you today. I took you out of your comfort zone, not to punish you, but to transform you. The fire of trial is never the end. It is the beginning of a purer faith. Time passed, and wrinkles appeared on the face of the once prince of Egypt. Moses no longer wielded his staff with the same strength, but his faith remained unshaken. The desert watched him grow old. The heavens watched him mature. And when the people he led were finally about to enter the promised land, God said something that sounded like a farewell. You will see it, but you will not enter it. For many, this would be defeat. For Moses, it was consecration. Because victory wasn't about arriving, it was about obeying to the end. He didn't see the promise fulfilled with his earthly eyes, but he was the one who paved the way for others to experience it. And this is the kind of glory the world will never understand, the glory of those who sow without reaping, yet remain faithful nonetheless. Moses climbed Mount Nebo alone. There were no crowds, no music, no recognition, just him, God, and the wind that blew like a memory of the past. From up there, he gazed at the promised land, vast, beautiful, distant, and smiled. Because the faithful servant understands that not every promise is fulfilled here. Some are only fulfilled in eternity. God called softly to him, "It is time, my servant." And there, amidst the silence and the breeze, Moses rested. There was no known tomb, no procession, no statue. God himself buried him. The man the world forgot was remembered by heaven, and the name the Egyptians erased became eternal in the history of faith. This is the silent victory, the one that needs no witnesses, because God himself is the one who sees it. It is the reward for those who choose to be faithful, even when no one applauds. For those who understand that service is greater than recognition, and perhaps today, God is calling you to experience this same victory, to remain steadfast, even without applause, to continue serving, even without reward, to remain in faith, even when there are no visible results, because true triumph lies not in what we achieve, but in who we become as we obey. Moses' victory wasn't crossing the sea, it was crossing himself, overcoming pride, fear, and loneliness. He finished the journey with his heart whole before God, and that's more than any promised land. Heaven is not impressed by those who arrive first, but rejoices with those who remain faithful to the end. And that is why, thousands of years later, when Jesus ascended the Mount of Transfiguration, who was at his side? Moses, the man the world forgot, but whom heaven never failed to honor. Because every silent obedience is an eternal echo. There is a silence that only those who have chosen to follow God's will know. It is the silence of forgetfulness. Moses felt it in the desert, when no one spoke his name anymore, when the palace of Egypt, the very one that had once echoed his princely voice, no longer remembered who he was. It was the price for choosing to be remembered by God, and this price always comes in the form of loneliness. At first, man believes that God's call will take him to high places, but he soon discovers that obedience leads him down a narrow path where human recognition disappears. This is where opposition begins. It comes not only from enemies, but from friends who don't understand, from family who call him a fool, from those who say, if God were really with you, why is the path so hard? Moses heard this too, in murmurs, in glances, in long, heavy silences. The weight of obedience separated him from everything that once gave him security. He traded the gold of Egypt for the dust of the desert. He traded comfort for uncertainty. He traded applause for anonymity. And yet, it was in anonymity that God began to write his eternity. Because when the world erases you, God begins to reveal you. Today, we live the same battle. There are those who choose to go with the flow of the world, to be seen, to be remembered, to be accepted. But there are also those who, like Moses, walk in another direction. People who refuse shortcuts, who prefer truth to success, who endure being forgotten on social media, ignored by human eyes, but who won't compromise on what God has told them in secret. And this is the greatest form of opposition of our time, living with purpose in a purposeless world. Modern opposition no longer comes from crowned pharaohs, but from systems that push you toward performance, appearance, and spectacle. It comes from the voices that try to convince you that being invisible is failure. But God always hides what is precious. He hid Moses for 40 years, not because he forgot him, but because he was shaping him into something the world would not understand. How many times have you felt this way? Forgotten, invisible, as if your prayers echoed in a silent sky. And yet, something inside you said, "Don't stop, keep going." This is the voice that sustained Moses when all seemed lost. He understood that opposition was not a sign of rejection, but of purpose, because the closer you get to the promise, the stronger the desert becomes. There are people who can only walk when there is applause. Moses learned to walk in silence. He was called to lead a people who murmured against him daily. Even after parting the sea, he heard criticism, ingratitude, and revolt. And yet he remained, because those who are remembered by God do not seek to be understood by men. This is the war few have the courage to fight, remaining faithful even when faithfulness isolates you. And at this point, the text turns to us. How often do we abandon God's voice to maintain people's favor? How often do we sacrifice our calling to avoid conflict? Moses teaches us that the price of calling is opposition, and the price of opposition is glory. The world will try to convince you that being forgotten is the end. But in the kingdom, being forgotten by the world is the beginning of being remembered by God. Human oblivion is the soil where God plants his greatest purposes. And while the world erases your name, heaven writes it in letters of fire. So don't be alarmed by silence. It's not absence, it's polishing. God hides his own while the world exalts itself. He erases faces to reveal souls. He closes doors to test hearts. And when the world forgets your name, remember, the God who revealed himself in the bush still knows yours. And perhaps that is the true test of faith today, staying faithful when no one is looking, loving God when he seems distant, and continuing to believe when everything screams to give up. Because it was precisely at the moment when Moses felt most forgotten that the fire appeared. And fire always comes to those who remain, not to those who flee. So if the world doesn't see you today, be thankful. You're at the same stage Moses was before he was used. Forgetfulness is the disguise of purpose. And when God decides to remember you before men, nothing and no one will be able to erase you. Let this thought echo in your heart. Sometimes God's silence is proof that he is preparing you for something that doesn't yet fit within your vision. When the desert seemed to be over, something began to move among the rocks and the wind. Moses walked alone, his heart exhausted, his soul scarred by years of silence and oblivion. And it was precisely there, at the point where the impossible seemed absolute, that God revealed himself. Not in palaces, not among the powerful, but in an ordinary bush in the midst of nothingness. Because it is in the arid terrain of impossibility that faith becomes visible. The bush burned, but was not consumed. A fire that burned without destroying. A mystery that defied all logic. And suddenly, Moses realized that fire was not meant to illuminate the desert. It was meant to awaken what lay dormant within him. It was God himself saying, "The impossible is my natural environment." Faith in the impossible is always born of pain. Not of euphoria, not of success, but of emptiness. It's when there's no more strength, when promises seem too old to be fulfilled, when time no longer makes sense. It's at that precise moment that God begins to act. Moses had to reach his human limit to see the supernatural, and so do we. In our day, the impossible continues to be the language of the kingdom. There are still burning bushes, only now not on the mountains, but in the circumstances of life, in diagnoses that say there is no longer a cure, in accounts that don't add up, in broken relationships, in hearts that no longer believe. And it is in these modern deserts that God still whispers, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy." Faith is not the absence of fear, it is a decision in the midst of it. Moses was afraid. He trembled before the divine voice. He questioned his ability, doubted his voice, his influence, his strength. and God responded with something disconcerting: "I will be with you." What seemed insufficient was, in fact, all he needed to hear. Because the power wasn't in Moses, it was in the presence that accompanied him. And the same happens to us. When everything seems beyond our reach, God doesn't give us answers. He gives us presence. He doesn't explain the desert. He walks with us through it. Faith in the impossible doesn't require understanding. It requires surrender. Moses didn't need to understand how the sea would part. He just needed to take the first step. And this is the secret the modern world has forgotten. We want proof before faith, but the kingdom demands faith before proof. Today, God still seeks people willing to walk without knowing where the wind will take them. People who obey before understanding, who move when logic dictates wait, who trust when God's silence seems like a negative response. Perhaps the impossible in your life isn't a burning bush, but an ancient promise, buried beneath years of failed attempts. Perhaps God is just waiting for the moment when your heart finally empties itself so he can rekindle the fire. The impossible always begins in the realm of human abandonment. When Moses gave up on being a prince, God made him a liberator. When he gave up on being recognized, God made him remembered. When he gave up on controlling time, God gave him an eternal mission. So it is with us. As long as we insist on doing things our way, the miracle awaits. But when we stop, God begins. There's something powerful about faith that persists when all seems lost. It's a silent but unbreakable force. The same one that sustained Abraham, Joseph, and David, and now reignites in Moses. It's the kind of faith that doesn't seek miracles to believe, but believes until the miracle happens. The impossible is not the end. It is the altar where God reveals who he is. It was there before the burning bush that Moses ceased to be a fugitive and became the chosen one. And perhaps it is there, exactly where you feel too small, too forgotten, too incapable, that God is about to light the fire that will change everything. There is no limit to those who trust. The same God who parted seas still opens paths amid pain. The same God who transformed an exile into a prophet still transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. The same God who spoke to Moses still speaks to those who dare to remain. And this is where the script turns to the viewer's heart. There is a fire within you that has not yet been extinguished, a calling that time has not been able to silence. Even if the world has forgotten your name, heaven still speaks it with hope. So, look again at the impossible before you and understand. What seems like the end is only where God begins. Faith is not the easiest path. It is the most eternal path. If this message spoke to you, write in the comments what God taught you amid your impossible challenges. Share this message with someone who needs a reminder that faith can still move mountains. And follow this channel to continue receiving messages that rekindle the fire of purpose within you. The fire had already been lit within Moses, but now it was time to test whether this fire was merely flame or also essence. Because faith, when untested, is still theory. And God, in his wisdom, doesn't test to destroy, he tests to reveal. The same desert that shaped Moses now led him to his greatest confrontation, facing that which once made him flee. Egypt wasn't just a geographic place, it was a symbol. It represented the past, the mistakes, the guilt, the voices that still echoed inside Moses' mind, saying, "You are not worthy. You failed, you killed, you fled." And now God was calling him precisely to return to the place of his pain. Because true healing doesn't happen when you forget what hurt you, but when you return there and realize you are no longer the same person. The man who left Egypt as a fugitive now returned as a prophet. What once carried guilt now carried authority. What once held fear now had a mission. But the path to this point was not one of glory, it was one of renunciation. This is the part many don't see, the price of obedience. Moses didn't just leave the palace, He left the very identity the world had built around him. The test wasn't just freeing Israel, it was freeing himself from himself. And this is where the text resonates with us, the modern-day Moseses, who struggle to obey a calling that seems impossible while the world offers us comfortable shortcuts. The ultimate test of faith doesn't happen when God speaks, but when he's silent, when your heart cries out and heaven seems far away, when you do everything right and nothing happens, when the sea hasn't yet parted and you have to believe it will only open after the first step. Imagine the scene. Moses standing before the sea, the people crying out behind him, the army approaching, fear suffocating. Logic screams, it's over, but faith whispers, wait. And in the midst of chaos, God doesn't send angels, doesn't send armies. He simply says, why do you cry out to me? Tell the people to march. March. That's the test. To move forward when everything tells you to stop. To believe when everything falls apart. To continue when there's no ground to stand on. The staff Moses carried was no longer a symbol of status. It was a symbol of faith. The same staff that accompanied him through the desert would now be used to divide the impossible in two. And so, before the sea, the sky bowed to the obedience of a man who did not bow to fear. The wind blew, the waters rose, and the impossible opened up in silence. No shouts, no music, no applause, only the sound of obedience ripping through the night. These days, the final test has neither seas nor pharaohs, but it carries the same spiritual weight. It's the moment when you must choose between comfort and purpose, between holding on to what is safe and trusting in what is eternal. God still places his children before closed seas, not to shame them, but to prove that the sea still obeys the voice of faith. Perhaps your sea is not physical, but emotional. Perhaps your Egypt is a memory that insists on trapping you. Perhaps your Pharaoh is the fear of being forgotten, the desire to be accepted, the need to control what God asked you to surrender. And it is at this point that faith becomes a cross. There is no true faith without renunciation. Moses didn't conquer Egypt by the sword, but by surrender. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He needed to be silent to be guided. This is the ultimate test, the silence of those who trust in the promise more than their own understanding. And when the sea parted, Moses didn't run, he walked. Because those who know God's process don't need to rush to see results. They simply walk in the certainty that the heavens move with their steps. God doesn't test you to see if you're faithful. He tests you to show you that you can remain faithful. The test is never about God's power. It's about your surrender. And when surrender is total, the impossible becomes just the beginning of a new path. Today, the voice of the Spirit still echoes, march, even when there is no path, even when fear whispers that it is too late. Even when all you have left is faith, march, because each step of obedience is a blow against the waters that try to stop you, and when you cross, you'll realize that the same sea that tried to swallow you will be the one that destroys your enemy. Because the final test doesn't end with the crossing, it ends when you understand that God's purpose has always been greater than your fear. If this word made you see your own sea, write here in the comments, I choose to march, and share this message with someone who needs to remember that faith is not about understanding the path, but about trusting the one who leads you. The sea closed, the wind died, the roar of the waters gave way to silence. And in that instant, Moses understood what power had not taught him in Egypt, what the desert had not explained to him in words, and what the miracle had only confirmed. That God's greatest victories are not those the world sees, but those witnessed by heaven. The journey was over, but something within him was beginning anew. The people celebrated with songs and drums. Miriam danced, the Israelites shouted. It was the victory everyone had been waiting for, the miracle everyone dreamed of. But while the crowd rejoiced, Moses remained silent. Because the heart shaped in the desert is no longer intoxicated by the sound of conquest. It knows that the noise of applause is brief, but the sound of presence is eternal. The man who was once a prince was now a servant. What was once exalted by men was now remembered by God. Moses no longer sought recognition, he sought permanence. He learned that true triumph lies not in being seen, but in being faithful when no one is looking. There is something profoundly sacred in this kind of victory, because the world celebrates results, but heaven celebrates constancy. Egypt crowned power, but God crowns the broken-hearted. And it was precisely this heart that Moses offered in silence, while the people cried out. Today, we are still drawn to the sounds of visible achievements. We want victories that everyone can applaud, miracles that can be posted, answers that can be proven. But the kingdom of God still works in the invisible. There are still miracles that happen silently, in the hearts of those who chose to continue even when no one noticed. Silent victory is the one that happens when you overcome your pride, when you choose to forgive instead of revenge, when you serve without expecting anything in return, when you remain even when you're tired, when you love without being loved in return, when you continue to believe without seeing. It's this kind of victory that makes the heavens rise. Moses understood that crossing the sea was just the beginning. The most difficult crossing would be within himself, because after the miracle comes the test of permanence, after the euphoria, the challenge of constancy. And this is the point where many give up, when they realize that God hasn't called them just to overcome, but to remain faithful after overcoming. This is why Moses' silence is more powerful than the people's song. His silence wasn't empty, it was adoration. It was gratitude disguised as reverence. It was the awareness that the God who opens seas also closes cycles, and that every closed cycle is proof of love, not abandonment. How often does God lead us to the shore of victory only to teach us to stand still and watch the sea close behind us? It's as if he's saying, don't look at what's past, I've already closed what hurt you. And it's in that moment that the soul learns to rest. Silent victory is the rest of those who trust. It's the moment when you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. It's when your heart understands that loyalty is more valuable than recognition. Today, God still writes stories like this. Stories that don't make headlines, but change destinies. Stories of people no one sees, but whom heaven observes with pleasure. People who pray in silence, who forgive without being applauded, who serve without being remembered. And the Lord still whispers to these hearts, I see you. Moses didn't emerge from the crossing seeking glory. He emerged more broken, more dependent, more aware that power belongs to God. Because the true servant doesn't need to be exalted. He just needs to keep listening to the voice that called him. Perhaps today your miracle also happened in silence. Perhaps no one knows what it cost to remain. Perhaps no one sees how much it hurt to trust. But heaven saw. And the same God who sustained Moses on the crossing is sustaining you now, even if in silence. And when you cross your sea, don't look for the sound of applause. Look for the sound of presence, because it is in this silence that God speaks loudest. If this word resonated with you, write in the comments, I want to learn to win in silence. And share this message with someone who needs to remember that the deepest victory is not the one that appears, but the one that lasts. The story of Moses is not just an ancient tale. It is a mirror that reflects what happens within us when God chooses to separate us from what the world calls success to teach us what heaven calls purpose. Moses was not just a liberator. He was a reminder that obedience is still the greatest act of faith and that true calling never seeks a stage, but rather a presence. We live in an age where being noticed seems more important than being transformed. Today's Egypt has different colors, different temples, different crowns, but it continues to seduce hearts with the same promises: visibility, prestige, control, recognition. And like Moses, many of us are being called to descend from our modern palaces, to leave behind thrones that shine on the outside but imprison us on the inside, Contemporary life pushes us toward performance exhaustion. Social media has become the new palaces of the ego, where everyone displays power, but few confess weakness. And yet, it is in weakness that God reveals his strength. It is when you choose to be forgotten by the world that God begins to remember you in secret. Moses learned that the solitude of the desert is more fruitful than the comfort of the throne. And perhaps this is what God is doing with many today, removing them from the spotlight to heal them in silence. Because there are wounds that only heal when no one is looking. There are gifts that only mature away from applause. There are voices that only learn to hear heaven when the noise of the world falls silent. Egypt values appearance, but God still chooses essence. The world asks, "What do you have?" But heaven asks, "Who have you become?" And that's why God's process is so uncomfortable, because he's not trying to promote us, he's trying to purify us. He's not trying to show us off, he's trying to expose us to his presence. Like Moses, there are people today being led to places that seem smaller, but are spiritually greater. There are those who are trading position for purpose, visibility for truth, status for holiness. And it is in this invisible movement that the kingdom advances. Moses teaches us that true leadership comes from surrender, not imposition. That the purest power is the power of service. That being remembered by God is infinitely more precious than being applauded by men. He was called a servant, and it is this title that heaven still honors. Look around. We live in a time when recognition is instant, but character is superficial. When many want ministry, but few want the desert. When there are more voices speaking of God than hearts listening to him. But the story of Moses calls us back to the essence. God still seeks those who prefer faithfulness to fame. The lesson is simple and profound. What the world calls loss, God calls preparation. What appears to be oblivion is actually refinement. Silence is not absence, it is strategy. And the desert is not punishment, it is school. Today, the Holy Spirit still leads men and women out of Egypt, not only to free others, but to free them from themselves. Because the greatest liberation happens when the throne of self gives way to the altar of surrender. Moses was remembered by God because he accepted being forgotten by men. He was exalted in heaven because he humbled himself on earth. And this is what the Lord continues to do, exalting those who serve, sustaining those who wait, remembering those who chose to remain faithful when no one else believed. Maybe you're in that place where it seems like no one sees you, no one values you, no one understands what God asked you to leave behind. But listen, it was there that God found Moses, and it's there that he finds you too, in anonymity, in renunciation, in solitude. It's in this invisible terrain that the greatest purposes are born. And when the time comes, the same God who hid you will be the God who reveals you. Not for your glory, but to fulfill what he promised. Because heaven never forgets those who chose to be faithful in silence. If this message spoke to your heart, write in the comments, "I choose to be remembered by God." And share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the process is never a loss. It's a preparation. There are victories the world will never applaud. There are achievements that don't make it to the stage, that don't grace screens, that don't win followers, but make all heaven rise in reverence. Moses' victory wasn't the brilliance of Egypt. It was the silence of the mountain. It wasn't the gold of palaces. It was the radiance of presence. It wasn't the echo of the crowds. It was the gentle sound of a God who knew him by name. And perhaps this is the most sacred part of the story. He was forgotten by men to be remembered by God. Moses' anonymity wasn't a weakness. It was a choice. He chose to live where few can bear to remain, in the shadow of purpose. And it is there that God reveals what the world does not understand. In the desert, in silence, in hiding, the Creator reveals himself to those who don't seek to be seen, but to those who desire to see. Moses didn't seek a throne, he sought presence. He didn't seek prominence, he sought a face. And God's face became his reward. Today, we live in an age that idolizes visibility. We're tempted to measure value by likes, relevance by numbers, faith by appearance. There's a modern weight in being noticed, an urgency in being remembered, a silent pain in being invisible. But it's in this very silence that God still speaks. It's there that he observes those who still seek him when no one else sees. Holy anonymity is the secret altar of a generation tired of proving its worth. It is the hiding place of those who understand that presence is worth more than the stage. Moses understood there is no greater victory than being remembered by God when the world forgets your name. He climbed the mountain, and there, where there was no applause, he saw the face of eternity. He did not descend with a crown, but with a radiance the world could not bear. And perhaps this is the victory God still seeks today. Not that of those who conquer multitudes, but that of those who conquer themselves. Not that of those who rule kingdoms, but that of those who rule their own hearts. Not that of those who are known by all, but that of those who are known by him. There are men and women even now being polished in silence, unknown pastors, faceless intercessors, mothers on their knees, young people who reject the easy path, souls who trade applause for obedience. God sees them. Heaven recognizes them. And when the trumpet of time sounds, they will rise with faces that reflect the brightness of the mountain. Moses' victory was silent, but eternal. And perhaps, in the end, this is the true triumph, to be forgotten by history, but remembered in eternity. For eternity does not applaud what the world celebrates. It honors what the world ignores. So if you feel your dedication has gone unnoticed, if your faithfulness has not generated recognition, if your love has been forgotten, remember, God still sees what the world overlooks. He writes stories that don't fit in the headlines. And one day, when all the spotlights are dimmed, the light of his presence will still shine upon those who have chosen holy anonymity. Stay strong. Keep doing good in silence. For there are eyes from heaven watching what the world overlooks. And when glory descends, it will be impossible to hide those who have walked with God in the shadows. You too are called to be remembered by God, not by the world. And if this message spoke to you, comment below. I choose holy anonymity. Like, share, and follow this channel so that more hearts weary of vanity find rest in the presence that never forgets. Time has passed, but the spiritual landscape remains the same. There are still pharaohs who demand visibility. There are still deserts that test the heart. And there is still a God who silently observes those who choose to be faithful even when no one else is watching. The story of Moses is a mirror that reveals what many today have forgotten, the value of the invisible process, because in the kingdom of God, what is unseen outweighs what is visible. We live in a time when haste consumes faith. We want immediate results, instant recognition, purpose without process. But the God of Moses still works in eternal rhythms. He doesn't rush because he is forming something that time cannot erase. Every season of silence, every prolonged wait, every hidden renunciation bears the same seal of the mountain, the seal of presence. When we look at Moses, we realize that his greatest lesson was not to free Israel, but to free himself from himself. And this is what the Spirit still does with us. He calls us to leave the Egypt of human expectations, to abandon the desperation to be seen, and to rediscover the beauty of living by faith. He leads us to understand that the desert is not punishment, it is purification. It is there that he removes from us what cannot enter the promised land. Today, perhaps your desert is not of sand, but of invisibility. Perhaps you feel forgotten, unrecognized, struggling to remain faithful amidst the silence. Perhaps you have obeyed, and yet everything seems at a standstill. But know this, God is still writing. He writes in the pauses. He speaks in the delays. He manifests himself in the absences. The story of Moses teaches that the invisible is the terrain of the chosen. He saw God because he learned to wait. He knew fire because he endured the cold. He heard the voice because he accepted silence. And this is the path that still shapes those who belong to the eternal. In our day, while the world races for relevance, God still calls the forgotten. He still chooses the unlikely, the weary, the discreet. He visits the anonymous worker, the lonely student, the father who prays in silence, the woman who carries faith in her daily life. He enters simple homes and transforms ordinary hearts into living temples of his glory. The lesson is clear. Don't seek to be remembered by the world. Seek to be remembered by heaven. Don't strive to be seen. Strive to remain pure. Because, in the end, heaven only crowns what the world has despised. The great names of this age will fade, but the bent knees will remain written in the book of eternity. Moses proves to us that true greatness is not being above everyone, but being under God's will. And this is the victory that time cannot erase. Perhaps today, your greatest act of faith is to keep going. Keep going even when no one understands. Keep going even when the promise is delayed. Keep going even when God's silence seems to surround you, because faith is not the sound of an answer, it is the decision to remain. In the end, everything Moses achieved came from a simple yet profound choice: to obey, even when there was no audience. And that is the lesson for us today. The secret of eternity is hidden in silent obedience. So don't be discouraged if the world doesn't see you. The same God who wrote Moses' name on the pages of history is writing yours in the invisible realm of eternity. And when time falls silent, heaven will echo your name, not because the world recognized you, but because you chose to remain. If this message spoke to you, write in the comments, "I choose to stay, even if no one sees." Like, share, and follow the channel, not out of vanity, but so that more people can rediscover the power of silence, the beauty of faith, and the rest of being remembered only by God. There is something sacred in remaining anonymous. Moses teaches us that true encounters with God do not happen before crowds, but before a solitary bush, in a forgotten desert, far from any human applause. It is there, when the sound of the world falls silent, that the heart begins to hear the sound of heaven. And perhaps this is the voice that many today are relearning to hear, the voice that speaks amidst the silence when all noise fades away. We live in an age where every gesture needs to be publicized, every achievement needs to be seen, and every good deed needs to be proven by likes. But the Spirit of God still works in secret. He still anoints those who serve in silence, those who pray without being noticed, those who help without being applauded, those who forgive without witnesses. God's glory continues to rest upon those who choose to remain faithful even without recognition. Moses spent 40 years tending sheep that weren't his, in a place no one knew. And it was precisely there that God prepared him to lead an entire people. The world calls it loss, but God calls it a process, and the same is true today. You may be in a season where nothing seems to be happening, but that's exactly where the eternal is shaping you. When no one sees you, he forms you. When no one calls you, he sends you. There are modern hearts living in the same desert as Moses, mothers who pray silently for their children and no one notices, men who support their homes with faith rather than recognition, young people who remain pure in a corrupt world and receive no applause for it. These are people who have learned the value of fidelity away from the spotlight. They are anonymous servants, but known in heaven, because God still reveals himself to those who choose to remain. He still kindles a fire in the desert. He still speaks to those who seek him without having to prove anything to anyone. And just as he called Moses on the mountain, he continues to call willing hearts, silent voices, entire lives that say, "Here I am, even if no one sees me." Holy anonymity is the altar where pride dies and God's presence dwells. It is the place where the self is silent and purpose speaks. It is the space where the servant becomes an instrument and the invisible becomes eternal. Those who live to be remembered by the world fade away quickly, but those who live to be remembered by God endure forever. Maybe you'll never stand in a pulpit. Maybe no one knows what you carry. Maybe your tears have no witnesses, but heaven is recording everyone. The same God who saw Moses in the wilderness sees you in the dawn. The same God who lit a fire in the bush continues to kindle faith in weary hearts. And one day, when all is revealed, those who served in silence will be the first to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." This is the victory of the forgotten, the reward of those who remained, the secret of those who walked with God while the world slept. Moses' story ends not with human glory, but with an eternal encounter. He climbs the mountain alone, and God welcomes him. There are no cameras, no audience, no echoing voices, only the sound of the wind and the touch of eternity. And this is how true servants end their journeys, unseen by men, but welcomed by God. May the world continue to value the stage. We will continue to value the altar. May the world continue to seek fame. We will continue to seek presence. Because in the end, what matters is not who saw you, but who called you. And if you feel that this word speaks to your spirit, write in the comments, "I choose to serve in silence until God speaks my name." Like, share, and follow the channel, not out of vanity, but so that more hearts find the strength to continue serving, even when no one is watching. And now, given all we've heard, it's no longer just a matter of understanding Moses' story, but of deciding what we'll do with our own. Because in the end, the voice that called Moses from the bush still calls to hearts in the midst of routine. The same presence that set a bush ablaze without consuming it wants to set ablaze lives that allow themselves to be consumed by faithfulness. Perhaps today your Egypt is the work that drains you, the comparisons that corrode you, the silence of God that tests you. But the message is simple and eternal. There is no anonymity for those who serve with truth. God sees, God hears, God records. He transforms the desert into an altar and weariness into a calling. What seems invisible to human eyes is visible before the throne. Moses teaches us that service is an act of war against the ego. And in the modern world, where every gesture seeks approval, choosing to be faithful without being seen is a miracle you can experience today. Start applying this truth where you are. Serve in silence. Pray for those who have forgotten you. Do good without advertising. Work with excellence even when no one recognizes it. Forgive before they ask for your forgiveness. Be the answer in a world that only knows how to complain. God still promotes those who remain, and remaining today means resisting the need to prove anything. It means waking up each day and saying, "Lord, I don't want to be great. I want to be yours." This is the prayer that changes destinies. This is the surrender that attracts heaven. So if this word has touched your spirit, don't let it die in your ears. Let it lead you to a real action. Turn off the noise for a moment, enter your personal desert, and say to God, "Here I am." This moment could be the beginning of a new season. And when silence comes, don't doubt. When no one notices, don't stop. When recognition doesn't come, keep going. Because the same God who raised Moses in obscurity is raising you now in a way that the world doesn't understand, but heaven applauds. If this message spoke to you, write in the comments, "I want to be remembered by God." Like, share, and follow the channel, so this flame may reach other weary hearts, and the world may rediscover the beauty of serving in silence.